And with us at the roundtable is Willie Janeway, the Executive Director of the Adirondack Council, the largest environmental watchdog and conservation group in the state of New York. Welcome. Good to see you again.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You've just released your annual State of the Park report. What are some of the highlights in it this year?
Well, we just put out our report. As you said, it's our annual report. And what's most fascinating and exciting about this is what we found, which is that there's an unprecedented level of agreement and consensus among different stakeholders in the Adirondacks about the need to do two big things: invest in infrastructure, clean water, and combating invasive species, and make the policy decisions necessary to update regulations on private land use and improve stewardship of state lands. The consensus that exists to do that is really unprecedented and important and exciting to see.
That hasn't always existed. There really, the past few years, seems to be this new sense of cooperation between a number of environmental groups, community leaders, and others.
Well, Tom, as you may have heard, there used to be a lot of lawsuits and conflicts in the Adirondacks over different issues, and there still will be times for those types of disagreements. But the overall tenor has changed. There's a lot more respect between communities and environmental advocates. The Adirondack Council, we have a big tent. We're focused on the ecological integrity and wild forest character of the Adirondack Park, but we believe in communities and wilderness thriving together, and we're finding a lot of people agree with us and want to help us address issues like invasive species, investment in infrastructure, updating outdated 1970s area regulations that govern the private land use in the park.
We'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics. Maybe we'll begin with the governor expanding wilderness protection to more than 30,000 acres, the Essex Chain Lakes, the Hudson River.
Yes.
What is so special about this land that's now being protected?
Well, the Adirondack Council looked at hundreds of different actions by the governor, by agencies, by the legislature, by appointed and elected officials, thumbs up on some, thumbs down on others, calling it like an umpire, calling it like we see it. And with the governor, the protection and the acquisition of additional lands, the Finch lands from the Adirondack Nature Conservancy, ensuring those will be protected in perpetuity, a huge thumbs up for that. Helping the communities, doing the Adirondack Challenge, getting some legislation passed, some grants to communities, big thumbs up on that. Definitely some concerns, though, over the actual management of state lands. We have to do a better job than we are now in managing those state lands to make sure we keep the invasive species out and to make sure the communities realize the long-term sustainable economic benefit in tourism that they need to see also for this to work.
And you talk about invasive species, the state passing the new invasive species law,
Yes.
applauded by you folks.
We applauded 3 different pieces of invasive species legislation that were passed this year, but in some ways it was a mixed decision. We got the 3 positives on the legislative front, but without funding to back that up, we fear it could end up over time being a hollow victory. And we have things like invasion milfoil. We have the spiny water flea now in Lake Champlain, in Lake George. We need to be aggressive on that, and that does require money. Laws and regulations by themselves will not do it. There need to be personnel, there needs to be education, and we feel that that second issue is critically important moving forward, and it's another example of where, wow, there's this consensus among different stakeholders that we should have the state investing in that, and those of us up here in the Adirondacks are prepared to partner with the state and help address that.
Are there real concerns that the spiny water flea now in Lake Champlain could move to other waterways in the Adirondacks?
It seems to spread very rapidly, and so the need to put in place a better system of education, enforcement, boat wash stations is really one of the big costs, even though it doesn't cost that much to put in a boat wash station. But we have 2,800 plus lakes in the Adirondacks. We have some like Lake George with a new protective system there. We need to develop a system that's a combination of individual lakes being preserved, but also making sure we have some gateways to the Adirondacks set up to guard invasives from coming in. It's for environmental reasons, it's for economic reasons, it's for public health, it's for clean water.
And you talk about spending money. Critics would say that enough hasn't been spent, that perhaps the spiny water flea could have been slowed, if not stopped from getting in Lake Champlain, if they had paid attention to the canal system and working on diversions there to keep that water from necessarily ending up in Lake Champlain. And they point to the fact that there could be a number of other invasives. In fact, they say there are a number of other invasives knocking on the door if attention isn't paid to trying to rectify the canal system to keep those invasives from coming in.
What I'm encouraged by is a diverse coalition of stakeholders that are recognizing those lessons to be learned from those mistakes in the past and not spending a lot of time beating each other up over those mistakes in the past, but looking at how do we go forward. Another good example, last week's gathering on road salt use in the Adirondacks. The state saying we want to decrease road salt. Communities saying we want to decrease road. Health advocates saying we want to decrease road salt. We want to make the roads safer, and with new technology we can do that, and we can stop rusting out all our cars up here in the Adirondacks so fast. That consensus on, okay, let's not put a lot of blame, but let's learn from those mistakes and learn going forward. And it's great to have the state committed to, on that front, decreasing road salt. On the invasive species, how do we change the management of the canal to keep the invasives out better?
And you mentioned that conference held last week at Paul Smith College. You hosted along with AdirondackAction.org.
And Paul Smith College and a
Paul
lot of
Smith
others.
College. The underlying concern is that there is evidence that that you're seeing road salt in watersheds in the Adirondack Park.
There's hard science coming in that there's uptrends in road salt, especially in the places right next to roads, in the water bodies. There's data in terms of how that can get into groundwater and how that can impact public health. And so there's agreement we need to address that, and the state is being increasingly aggressive about that. I'd like to see them move even faster, but there's agreement that there needs to be movement on that. Thankfully, in the Adirondacks, we're not at the levels of some of the communities down in the Hudson Valley that have much higher levels of parts per million of salt in the water. So we have the opportunity to address this problem up here before it gets too bad.
And you mentioned that for years folks have been looking for alternatives. Are they at the point where they have found any alternatives? Because obviously safety is a concern in the Adirondacks with the winter and the snow up here. Are they getting to the point where they have found alternatives that can work as well, if not better, than salt?
The short answer is yes. And there's a variety of, and the Adirondack Council has been an advocate on this for years. We've put out reports, the need for a low sodium diet, playing on the health benefits. It's about safe roads and clean water, protecting our infrastructure so it doesn't rust out, and protecting public health. And there's agreement on that. There are new technologies from the speed, and some of it is simple. The speed that the truck drives when it is spreading, whatever it's spreading, if it's salt, at a slower speed, you don't get as much splatter off the road, and so you don't get as much spillage into the watershed nearby. At 25 miles an hour instead of 35 miles an hour, you have a lot less negative impact from the salt. More judicious use of salt, trying to make sure we have better sunlight coming in on roads so that we get the power of the sun, meaning you use less salt. I could go on and on, but there are some things that aren't that complicated. There's also new technology with alternatives to salt that have real promise.
The State of the Park report, do you get into climate change and the warming that we're seeing in the Adirondacks and the concern about the impact that could have on the environment and wildlife?
Yes, the Adirondack Council gives a thumbs up in our State of the Park report to the legislature, to the governor for passing and signing legislation to help communities be more resilient, with making sure that the state, when it's doing projects, looks at issues, whether it be down on Long Island and sea level rise, or up here on floodplains, and making sure as we replace culverts, we're redesigning them to allow them to better address this increased frequency of storms that we are experiencing. So that's a positive that things are being done. What's missing is not so much the statements of support from our leaders and some of the legislative things that were put in place. What's missing, as with invasive species, is the funding to back up the changes that communities need. We can't just tell communities they should do something differently. We need to provide the resources to help small North Country Adirondack communities do it right.
Is there a real concern about the impact potentially on wildlife? I know the Audubon Society just within the past couple of weeks has put out a study, national study, saying that hundreds of bird species could be displaced, could be impacted by warming temperatures. In the Adirondacks, they say it could affect everything from songbirds to eagles to the common loon.
To the loon, the Adirondack Council logo. And the need for action to protect the bird life, to protect the economy up here in the Adirondack North Country helps to create a coalition, which is part of what's so unique about what's going on right now in the Adirondacks, yes.
You talk about the coalition and working together. There is a divisive issue right now. There are more than one, certainly. When you talk about everyone working together, one issue that still seems to divide a number of people in the Adirondack Park is this idea of whether to take the state-owned rail corridor that runs from Remsen to Lake Placid, turn the majority of it into an upgraded railroad corridor tracks, improve the tracks, but take from Tupper Lake to Lake Placid and turn those tracks into a recreation trail. And The state has decided that it's going to update the management plan
Yes.
for this. You aren't taking sides on this controversial issue, but you are asking the state to keep a certain number of principles or things in mind?
The Adirondack Council has set a bunch of principles out proactively that we feel should be a part of decision making, and it's encouraging that the state and other stakeholders are embracing those. We need to make sure that the integrity of that corridor is protected. After years and years of promises to communities that will use that corridor in a way that will help the communities, it's time to actually capitalize on the asset that corridor represents from an economic perspective. And that could be done with trains, that could be done with recreational, maybe in places it can be done with a blend of the two. What's most important is that we make decisions, and sometimes that's hard for our elected leaders, especially in election season, but we don't need to do a lot more. We need an open, transparent process, public input on the alternatives, and then we need state decisions on when and where they can invest capital and infrastructure to make sure that corridor can be used by a lot of people, can be used in a way that's protective of the environment, and can be used in a way that helps the communities by bringing economic activity and jobs to communities like Tupper Lake that so sorely need that.
And you mentioned Tupper Lake. Obviously, Tupper Lake's still waiting for years now for a resolution to the legal challenge to the Adirondack Club and Resort. Just within the past few days, an appeal process, an appeal was rejected by the appellate court,
Correct.
but now the two environmental groups are going to file a motion directly with the Court of Appeals, the highest court in New
Yes.
York, to continue to pursue this. Basically, their argument is that not a thorough enough study was done on the impact of wildlife in the area around Big Tupper, where the developers want to put these luxury camps in up to 700 homes. You folks signed off on this project years
Well,
ago.
let me clarify.
Okay.
We participated, invested heavily in the process, bringing hundreds of thousands of dollars of science into the record to inform the decision making. There were parts of the project that we liked and parts we didn't, and we said, with changes that meet our needs, we will support this project.
Okay.
Some of the changes we wanted were made. Other changes were not made. The park agency then made their approval, and we recognized the authority, the priorities of the park agency to make that decision, whether we agreed with it or not. It's really time to move on from the Adirondack Council's perspective, to move ahead. Tupper Lake needs a Main Street, it needs jobs on Main Street, it needs projects. We need to have a vibrant community there. We need to preserve the backcountry, and we need to advance some of the proposals that the Adirondack Council and our partners have put together to reform and upgrade the Adirondack Park Agency, to put more science in the process. So the next time there's a project like this, the whole economic review permitting process works better than it did this time.
Did you have lingering questions or doubts about the environmental impact study and whether it had been thoroughly studied enough?
An example, we had hoped that certain studies would be completed before decisions were made. Now some decisions have been made, those studies still haven't been done, but we're moving forward. We will continue to watch carefully to make sure there's other permits that would need to be issued, and we will monitor and watch that, and we're not afraid, even if it's unpopular, to challenge things that we think are wrong. But when an agency makes a decision that's within their authority, rather than challenging that, we're going to work with them to try and help them move forward and update their regulations and update their policies, which is what we're doing here with the park agency.
Do you respect the other environmental groups here continuing to challenge this, or do you think that this is not in the best interest of anyone to continue to appeal this whole process?
As an environmentalist, I understand where they're coming from.
The EPA
Yes.
delivered a setback to Governor Andrew Cuomo in the past few days. The governor was
Tappan
really
Zee.
the Tappan Zee Bridge needs to be replaced. Cost estimates from $4 to $5 billion.
Yes.
The governor was really counting on about $500 million, about $500 million, coming from the EPA to help pay for it. But the EPA said no, and a number of people actually thought that was good because they were worried about where that money would be diverted from.
Our State of the Park gave a thumbs down to the governor's proposal to raid the Clean Water Capital Fund, which is federal money, as you point out, that comes to the state to then provide in loans and sometimes in grants to communities. When I worked at DEC, we found ways of not just doing loans, but also doing grants to communities to help them with clean water infrastructure. The proposal from the state and what they were moving forward to do was to raid hundreds of millions of dollars from that fund to pay for the Tappan Zee, without putting out a clear plan for how to pay for the Tappan Zee. I know the Tappan Zee Bridge, I know it needs to be replaced, so I don't think we should be debating that. But we do need a financing plan, and we should recognize that the right way to use the monies in the Clean Water Fund are for true clean water projects, communities like Elizabethtown, that has individual septic systems for large facilities. That's not the right way to provide a base for economic growth or to protect clean water. We should be providing funds for those communities. It's an environmental win and an economic win, and there is money in that fund that should go to those projects instead of going to the Tappan Zee Bridge.
A few weeks ago, Adirondack Council teamed up with some other environmental groups to hold a forum in Plattsburgh to discuss the oil trains that are running across the border and through the Adirondack Park along Lake Champlain, hauling millions of gallons of Bakken crude oil every day down through the corridor to Albany, where it's being stored and then sent on from there. What are the biggest concerns? It seems within the past few months that this has become more of an issue and it's on more people's radar now. What are the biggest fears and concerns about this oil that's being transported?
Well, the oil transport is another example, as with invasive species, as with infrastructure, where there's this great coalition of community and environmental interests coming together and looking to the state and looking to the federal government to take leadership roles and address this. The issue right now with the oil is we kind of have this finger pointing, with the state saying, oh, it's a federal problem, and the feds pointing at the state. We don't need that. We don't need a lot of extensive public comment period. We need an open, transparent process, and then we need decisions. The retirement of those dangerous oil cars should be accelerated. The state should be stepping up and doing more where it has regulatory authority in places like the Port of Albany. There's opportunities for folks to do more. We're in the election season right now. We don't need a lot more studies. We need actual action. God forbid something happen. Look at the long-term economic devastation in Alaska from the oil spill up there. Look at the impact on human lives from some of the accidents that have happened. We should be acting now and not waiting for that to happen here in our Adirondacks.
And you talk about the dangerous oil cars, the
Yes.
DOT 111 tanker cars. The federal government has proposed phasing them out within 2 years. The Adirondack Council applauds that, and are you
Yes.
encouraging people to try to make that happen and let the government know that you want to see that happen?
We want to see that happening. We want to see it move faster if that's possible, and we want to see the state taking action too.
Many people worried about the fact that the trains run right along the shore of Lake Champlain.
And right next to and right through communities, as you know, Tom.
Exactly. And we've seen derailments. Obviously, everyone certainly remembers Lac Megantic last year and the disaster there. Is the bigger concern the environmental danger and threat that if one of those trains derails along Lake Champlain, the devastating impact that could have on the lake?
Worried about the communities, worried about the lake, and at a broader level, we need to be combating climate change. We need to come up with more sustainable energy plans. That oil is not the solution to our long-term energy needs. More solar, more conservation, there are opportunities there that we should be doing more on also. And that would be one place where the state and the federal governments both could take more aggressive action than they are right now.
And you mentioned the finger pointing back and forth. Other than pressuring the federal government to try to phase out the DOT 111 tanker cars, are there additional steps that the Adirondack Council is taking or encouraging others to take to try to put more pressure on either the state or the federal government to do other things to address this?
We consider it as environmental advocates for your park a sign of success when the decision makers start pointing fingers at each other, because they're not debating whether something should be done or not. They have great expertise. As you know, I worked at DEC as a regional director for 6 years. There's good people in the department who will have excellent ideas if they're directed to come up with a list of things that we can do. They know their rules, they know what they can do and not do. What's needed is leadership from the executive to say, do it. And we know they get it, that they have to do something. We'd like to see them actually do more.
Does the state of the park look forward to some of the major challenges still out there? And if so, what are they?
It does. Not only does it look back for the last year, thumbs up, thumbs down, it looks at all that in whole and says, what is the state of the park? And the state of the park is far from finished. There is a lot to still be done, and so we explicitly recommend, with others, investment in infrastructure, clean water, in combating invasive species, and policy decisions that update 1970s area regulations for the Adirondack Park Agency regarding private land use and development incentives, and also for management of state land. So those are the major recommendations, because the park isn't finished and we want to move forward. We want to secure the future for people and for nature.
There were some encouraging signs from both the Supreme Court and the EPA in recent months,
Yes.
both having to do with air pollution. and both potentially impacting acid rain in the Adirondack Park.
And you and your readers can see the Adirondack Council State of the Park report online and look at it there as you commented as we were coming in today. The Supreme Court decision affirming the interstate pollution rule, helping us combat acid rain after 30 years of effort by the Adirondack Council and many other partners at the national and local level. A great success there. So yes, there are good things happening, but we find that we have to keep the pressure on every day from the Adirondack Council. Our government gets distracted by other competing agenda items.
10, 15 years ago, if we were sitting here, acid rain would be right at the top of our list about the
It would
impact
be.
it was having on the Adirondack Park at the time. Are we making strides in reducing it, and is the park overall recovering
The
from
concern we have on acid rain is because the loons have come back, people think it's done. And it's not. We still have lakes that are dead. We still have loons struggling. So we're actually hosting a conference with Environmental Defense Fund and others in Saratoga Springs on October 16th, pulling together the scientists, people like Dr. Driscoll, what's being done, what has to be done next to use a football analogy, get into the end zone and finally be able to declare victory on that. But what has moved up is the need for funding for infrastructure, things like invasive species, climate change, clean water. We had a lot of money and we invested a lot of money in the 70s in projects that had an expected 30 to 40 year life. Well, the 1970s were 40 plus years ago. And so the need to make a new investment there. The Comptroller's Office put out a report on cracked infrastructure, cracks in infrastructure, the state of infrastructure, putting a spotlight on the need for $3.8 billion a year investment for the next 15 to 20 years, and maybe $1 billion a year being invested right now. There's this one-time court settlement coming into the state of billions of dollars. Many of us feel that gives the leadership in New York State a really unique opportunity, not to squander that away with this here and that there, but to put it into environmental infrastructure, generate jobs, and help lift the whole state and the Adirondacks up to a better future.
A number saying don't put it in the general fund, dedicated either for infrastructure, highway needs, but you would argue perhaps consider the environment as well.
Well, the infrastructure, roads, bridges, clean water, environmental, making sure there's land conservation, those things are part of that. And
a number of communities rebuilding for preparing for more storms, preparing for another Irene, and a lot of that is going into the highway infrastructure now, is building bigger and better.
We could have an Adirondack infrastructure fund with some of that would help jumpstart and improve our environmental protection and the resilience of our communities economically and environmentally.
And now you mentioned, we'll put the link to the state of the park on our website. And Willie, Janeway, it's good to see you. Thanks for stopping by.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.